Cold War origins revealed. Part 1. The end of World War II and the seeds of the Cold War. When World War II came to an end in 1945, much of the world celebrated the defeat of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. But beneath the celebrations, a new and even longer conflict was quietly taking shape. This struggle would not be fought with direct battles between the main powers, but through espionage, propaganda, proxy wars, and constant threats of nuclear destruction. History would call it the Cold War. The Cold War was essentially a confrontation between two superpowers that emerged after the Second World War, the United States and the Soviet Union. On the surface, both nations had been allies against Hitler, but their alliance was fragile, built only on necessity. Deep down, their political and economic systems were completely opposed. The United States represented capitalism and liberal democracy, a system that defended private property, free markets, and individual freedoms. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, stood for communism, where the state controlled the economy and promoted a one-party rule under Marxist-Leninist ideology. This clash of ideologies soon transformed into a global rivalry. Each superpower wanted to expand its influence across the world, and every new territory, government, or revolution became a potential battleground between East and West. But at the heart of this tension was one undeniable reality: both nations had emerged from the war with immense power. The United States had the atomic bomb, a weapon that shocked the world in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet Union, determined not to be left behind, began its own nuclear program. Within just a few years, the balance of terror was established. Both sides had the power to destroy the world. The Cold War, therefore, was not just a political or military competition. It was also a psychological struggle, one that spread fear, suspicion, and paranoia across the globe. People began to live with the constant idea that a nuclear war could break out at any moment. Europe's Cold War divide. 2. The division of Europe and the Iron Curtain. After the end of World War II, Europe was in ruins. Cities had been bombed, economies collapsed, and millions of people were displaced. Into this fragile landscape, the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union quickly spread. In 1946, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill gave a famous speech in which he declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across the continent. On one side of this curtain stood Western Europe, supported by the United States and leaning toward capitalism and democracy. On the other side lay Eastern Europe, dominated by the Soviet Union and organized under communist regimes. This division was not merely symbolic. In the years that followed, the Soviet Union established strict control over countries such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, East Germany, Romania, and Bulgaria. These nations became satellite states, tied politically, economically, and militarily to Moscow. Meanwhile, the United States took steps to prevent the spread of communism further west. In 1947, President Harry Truman announced what became known as the Truman Doctrine, a policy pledging American support to any country threatened by communism. This doctrine soon became the backbone of U.S. foreign policy during the Cold War. To reinforce this commitment, the U.S. also introduced the Marshall Plan, an ambitious program to rebuild Western Europe with billions of dollars in economic aid. This plan not only revived economies but also strengthened political alliances against the Soviet Union. The Soviets responded with their own version of economic cooperation, the Comecon, and tightened their grip on Eastern Europe. By the late 1940s, Europe was firmly divided into two opposing blocs. The tension escalated further in Germany. The country had been divided into four occupation zones controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. But when the Western powers decided to unify their zones to create a stronger West Germany, the Soviets retaliated by cutting off access to Berlin in 1948. This move led to the Berlin blockade, one of the first major crises of the Cold War. In response, the Western Allies organized the Berlin Airlift, a massive operation that supplied food, fuel, and necessities to the people of West Berlin entirely by air. For almost a year, planes flew day and night, until the Soviets finally lifted the blockade. This confrontation made it clear, the Cold War was no longer just an ideological rivalry. It was a geopolitical standoff that could erupt into direct conflict at any moment. Cuban Crisis, Nuclear Showdown. 4. The Cuban Revolution and the Missile Crisis. By the late 1950s, the Cold War had reached the Western Hemisphere. In 1959, Fidel Castro led the Cuban Revolution, overthrowing the US-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista. Castro soon aligned with the Soviet Union, transforming Cuba into a communist state just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. The United States was alarmed. In 1961, the CIA attempted to overthrow Castro through the Bay of Pigs invasion, a mission carried out by Cuban exiles. The plan failed disastrously, humiliating Washington and pushing Cuba even closer to Moscow. The following year, tensions reached a terrifying peak. In 1962, American spy planes discovered that the Soviets were secretly installing nuclear missiles in Cuba. These weapons could strike almost every major U.S. city within minutes. President John F. Kennedy responded by ordering a naval blockade of the island, demanding that the missiles be removed. For 13 days, the world held its breath. Many feared that nuclear war was imminent. Behind the scenes, frantic negotiations took place. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev eventually agreed to withdraw the missiles in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba and the secret removal of American missiles from Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis was perhaps the closest the Cold War ever came to triggering a full-scale nuclear war. It demonstrated both the dangers of brinkmanship and the desperate need for communication between the superpowers. In the aftermath, a direct hotline was established between Washington and Moscow, allowing their leaders to speak instantly in a crisis. The world had stepped back from the edge of destruction, but the crisis left a deep mark on global politics. The Cuban Missile Crisis also showed that the Cold War was no longer limited to Europe or Asia. It was a truly global conflict, capable of igniting dangerous standoffs anywhere on Earth. NATO vs. Warsaw Pact explained. 3. NATO, the Warsaw Pact, and the militarization of the conflict. The Berlin blockade had revealed just how fragile peace in Europe was. In response to the growing Soviet threat, the United States and its allies sought a more permanent form of military cooperation. In 1949, they established the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. Its members included the United States, Canada, and 10 Western European countries. The principle was simple but powerful: if one member was attacked, it would be considered an attack on all. NATO became a cornerstone of Western defense and a symbol of unity against Soviet aggression. The creation of NATO alarmed the Soviet Union. To counterbalance this alliance, in 1955 the Soviets organized the Warsaw Pact, a military coalition of Eastern European nations under Moscow's leadership. The two alliances effectively formalized the division of Europe into hostile camps. The arms race soon intensified. Both the United States and the Soviet Union sought to outmatch each other in military technology. The early 1950s saw the development of nuclear weapons far more powerful than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The hydrogen bomb, tested by both superpowers, drastically raised the stakes of any potential conflict. For ordinary people, the fear of nuclear war became a part of daily life. Governments built bomb shelters, schools held duck-and-cover drills, and propaganda on both sides emphasized the possibility of annihilation if the other bloc was not contained. Beyond Europe, the rivalry spread to other parts of the world. Both superpowers competed to expand their influence in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The Cold War was no longer confined to the European continent, it was becoming a global struggle. One of the earliest and most significant flashpoints outside Europe was Korea. In 1950, the Korean War erupted when Communist North Korea, supported by the Soviet Union and later China, invaded South Korea, which was backed by the United States and other Western allies under the United Nations. The brutal conflict ended in 1953 with a stalemate, reinforcing the global nature of the Cold War. By the mid-1950s, it was clear that the Cold War had moved far beyond a political disagreement. It was now an armed standoff between two massive alliances, each ready to unleash unimaginable destruction if provoked. Cold War's hidden battles. 5. The Vietnam War and proxy conflicts. While Europe remained divided, the Cold War increasingly played out through proxy wars, conflicts where the US and the USSR supported opposite sides without directly fighting each other. One of the most significant of these wars took place in Vietnam. After World War II, Vietnam had been divided between the Communist North, led by Ho Chi Minh, and the anti-communist South, backed by the United States. In the early 1960s, Washington escalated its involvement, sending military advisors, then combat troops, to support South Vietnam. The US saw the conflict through the lens of the domino theory, the fear that if one country in Asia fell to communism, others would soon follow. The Vietnam War soon became one of the most controversial and costly conflicts of the Cold War. Despite advanced technology and firepower, the US struggled against the guerrilla tactics of the Viet Cong and the determination of the North Vietnamese army. At the same time, the Soviet Union and China provided weapons, supplies, and training to the North, turning Vietnam into a key battleground of the ideological struggle. By the late 1960s, images of the brutal war and heavy American casualties sparked massive protests at home and abroad. The conflict deeply divided U.S. society, raising questions about the country's role as a global policeman. After years of fighting, the U.S. gradually withdrew its forces, and in 1975, Saigon fell, marking the end of the war with a communist victory. The Vietnam War highlighted the human cost of the Cold War, with millions of Vietnamese civilians and soldiers killed, along with over 58,000 Americans. It also showed that even a superpower could be humbled in a conflict against a determined local resistance. Beyond Vietnam, the Cold War sparked or influenced other proxy conflicts in Korea, Angola, Afghanistan, and Central America, turning local struggles into pieces of a much larger geopolitical chess game. Cold War's relaxation era. 6. Détente and the easing of tensions. By the early 1970s, after decades of high-stakes rivalry and devastating proxy wars, the Cold War entered a period known as détente, a French word meaning relaxation. Both the United States and the Soviet Union had reasons to seek a temporary easing of tensions. The US was emerging from the Vietnam War deeply divided and eager to reduce military commitments abroad. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was struggling with economic stagnation and the enormous cost of keeping up in the arms race. One of the hallmarks of détente was the pursuit of arms control agreements. The Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT-I, in 1972 led to the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which restricted certain missile defense systems and was seen as a crucial step in limiting nuclear escalation. Another major symbol of détente was the Helsinki Accords of 1975, in which over 30 countries, including both superpowers, agreed to respect human rights, territorial boundaries, and greater cooperation across Europe. At the same time, U.S. President Richard Nixon made a historic visit to China in 1972, opening diplomatic relations with Beijing. This was part of a larger strategy to exploit the rift between China and the Soviet Union, reducing Moscow's influence while reshaping the global balance of power. Economically, détente allowed for more trade and scientific exchange between East and West. Cultural exchanges and joint space missions, such as the Apollo-Soyuz test project in 1975, symbolized the possibility of cooperation even in an era of rivalry. However, détente had its limits. Critics in the West accused the Soviet Union of ignoring human rights commitments, while hardliners in Moscow feared that cooperation with the West could weaken socialism. By the end of the decade, new crises, including the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, would shatter the spirit of détente and bring the Cold War into a renewed phase of hostility. Cold War tensions rise. 7. The return of tensions in the 1980s. By the early 1980s, the fragile peace of détente had collapsed. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 shocked the world and convinced many in the West that Moscow was expanding its influence aggressively. The United States responded by boycotting the 1980 Moscow Olympics and imposing economic sanctions on the Soviet Union. At the same time, Ronald Reagan, who became U.S. President in 1981, adopted a far more confrontational approach. He described the Soviet Union as an evil empire and launched a massive military buildup, increasing defense spending to unprecedented levels. One of Reagan's most ambitious initiatives was the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, often called Star Wars. This program proposed building space-based missile defense systems that could intercept Soviet nuclear weapons. Although the project never became fully operational, it signaled America's determination to outpace the USSR technologically and militarily. Meanwhile, tensions escalated in Europe. The deployment of U.S. Pershing II and cruise missiles in Western Europe was met with Soviet countermeasures, fueling public protests across the continent. Many feared that Europe would become the battlefield of a potential nuclear confrontation. Economically, the Soviet Union was under increasing strain. The centralized system struggled to provide for its population while keeping up with America's technological advances. Shortages of consumer goods, inefficiency, and corruption worsened living conditions, leading to growing dissatisfaction among Soviet citizens. Despite the harsh rhetoric, Reagan also left the door open for negotiation. By the mid-1980s, when new leadership emerged in the Soviet Union, the stage was set for an unexpected shift toward dialogue and reform. This turning point would come with the rise of Mikhail Gorbachev, whose policies would fundamentally change the course of the Cold War. Berlin Wall breakthrough. 9. The fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of Eastern Bloc control. By the late 1980s, the policies of Gorbachev and the growing demand for freedom across Eastern Europe set the stage for dramatic change. Citizens in countries like Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Romania began demanding reforms and democratic governance. In 1989, after weeks of protests and political pressure, the Berlin Wall, which had divided East and West Berlin since 1961, was opened. The event became a global symbol of the collapse of communist control in Eastern Europe. Families separated for decades were reunited, and crowds celebrated in the streets, waving flags and climbing the wall itself. The fall of the Berlin Wall triggered a domino effect. Communist governments across Eastern Europe began to crumble, often peacefully, as citizens embraced elections, new constitutions, and freedoms that had been denied for decades. In Germany, the process culminated in reunification in 1990, with East and West Germany merging into a single democratic nation. This was not just a political victory but a profound cultural and emotional moment for millions who had lived under division. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union itself was facing growing unrest. Republics such as Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Georgia, and Ukraine demanded independence, challenging Gorbachev's authority. Economic struggles, coupled with political pressure, further weakened the central government. The events of 1989 demonstrated that the Cold War was nearing its end. The superpower standoff that had dominated global politics for over 4 decades was finally unraveling, and the world was entering a new era of international relations. Cold War, lasting impact explained. 10. The formal end of the Cold War and its legacy. By 1991, the Cold War officially came to an end. The Soviet Union dissolved into 15 independent republics, marking the definitive collapse of communist control in Eastern Europe and ending decades of global tension between East and West. The United States emerged as the sole superpower, while Russia and the other former Soviet republics faced the challenge of rebuilding politically, economically, and socially. Nations in Eastern Europe transitioned to democratic systems and market economies, though the process was often difficult and uneven. The end of the Cold War did not erase its impact. The arms race had left the world with massive stockpiles of nuclear weapons, and the competition for influence had reshaped international alliances. NATO, originally formed to counter the Soviet threat, continued to exist, while new partnerships and global institutions emerged to manage a multipolar world. The Cold War also left a lasting legacy in culture, technology, and society. Space exploration, military innovations, and global communications were accelerated by the rivalry between the superpowers. Intelligence agencies, espionage stories, and Cold War politics continue to captivate historians and the public alike. Ultimately, the Cold War defined the second half of the 20th century. It shaped the borders, economies, and political structures of countless nations, and its lessons about diplomacy, deterrence, and ideology remain relevant today. The world had survived decades of tension and the constant threat of nuclear war, learning that even in the darkest times, diplomacy and dialogue could prevent total catastrophe.